Okay, hello everyone. This is going to be the lecture video for China and Europe at the end of the post-classical era. This is the last set of notes before the test over Unit 2. So you're responsible for these notes, for understanding the content. The content isn't super challenging. It's just kind of, memorization stuff. So this video is going to focus on China at the end of the post-classical era, and then I'll do a separate one on Europe. Yeah. Okay. So we're reading with our background recap slide. We've already talked about the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties. That was back in Unit 1. Remember the short-lived Sui dynasty that built the Grand Canal using compulsory labor and high taxes. Then that dynasty fell very quickly and was replaced by the Tang and Song dynasties. These were during China's golden age, where China is innovating lots of technology like porcelain, gunpowder, paper money, the compass. They're also using a Confucian government system where where young men memorize Confucian texts, then have to pass the civil service exam, and then they get to work in the government, in the bureaucracy. That raises their social hierarchy so that they're the top level in that spam social hierarchy that we've talked about. We also have said that because of Confucianism, China is very patriarchal. They have foot binding. They were also engaged in the tributary system at this time, where they're influencing the tributary states like Korea, Japan, Vietnam. All of that we covered with Unit 1. So hopefully that was a little review. Then, when the Song dynasty falls, the Mongols replace them. Remember that the Mongols moved into China, they conquered the Song dynasty, and Kublai Khan set up the Great Khanate, also known as the Yuan dynasty, and ruled China for about 100 years during the post-classical era, about 1250-ish to 1350. Remember that Kublai Khan was religiously tolerant, but he didn't love the Confucian government system, so he brought in foreigners like Persian workers to run the government. He also was very protective of his culture. He didn't want the Chinese marrying with the Mongols or learning their language or anything like that. But at some point, many of the Mongols become Sinicized. Then the plague breaks out, and it becomes harder for the Mongols to control China. And eventually, a lot of the Mongols in the government leave China. The remaining ones get Sinicized. And China goes back to having traditional Chinese rule run by an ethnically Chinese family. And that dynasty is known as the Ming dynasty. Ming meaning brilliant. And that dynasty is going to last from 1368 to 1644, so about 300 years. And their founding emperor is named Emperor Hongwu. So here's what Hongwu does when he starts this Ming dynasty. So here's like the beginning of our actual notes. That's not just a recap, things that we've covered before. So Emperor Hongwu is part of the military group that gets rid of the Yuan dynasty. He immediately tries to get rid of any evidence that the Mongols ruled China. For example, he doesn't permit the use of Mongol names or dress style. He brings back the Confucian government system. So we're returning to bureaucracies, civil service exam. He continues to use mandarins and eunuchs, those government advisors, to help carry out his policy. Remember that the mandarins worked in local areas, whereas the eunuchs were the trusted government advisors that worked directly with the emperor. He also compiles an encyclopedia or excuse me, his descendants, sorry. They compile an encyclopedia that details Chinese culture, traditions, history, and philosophy, trying to preserve Chinese culture and again, kind of make China Chinese again, make it look like the Mongols were never in China, and bringing back government centralization. So all of that is just government stuff, kind of going back to how things have always been in China. Next thing is economic issues. So the Ming Dynasty is going to work on economic recovery because the plague has happened. So the economy's gone down, the population's gone down, but they're going to work on kind of rebuilding regional trade within China. So domestic trade, meaning trade within China, surges because people are making porcelain, silk, textiles, They're rebuilding irrigation systems so that people can farm. However, the government does not actively promote trade with distant lands. This is for a very specific reason. If we think context, the Mongols have just controlled China. The Mongols were foreigners. The Ming leaders are trying to reestablish China as a like ethnically Chinese place. They do not want foreigners in China. They don't want any foreigners threatening China. They don't want any foreigners potentially coming in and taking over China. So they're very wary of foreigners, don't want them in China. So the government is not doing a lot of actively promoting long distance trade. However, local merchants do still try to trade, especially with Japan and Southeast Asia. But this time period marks a change for China. They're finally getting to a point where the government is not promoting long distance trade. And at one point, we'll say this in our next unit, but at one point, the government outlaws foreign trade. So trade within China is strong, trade outside of China is more limited. And just to kind of recap the goods that come from China, China trades porcelain, silk, and tea. Those are the main things coming out of China. Some merchants will still try to get things from Japan, Southeast Asia, spices, horses from Central Asia, but the government's not doing a ton of actively promoting foreign trade. Okay, and then I think this is our last thing. Yep, this is our last thing for China. The last thing we want to know about the Ming Dynasty for now is that it's the Ming Dynasty that initially sponsors the voyages of Zheng He. Remember, Zheng He was one of our post-classical travelers. He is, for all intents and purposes, a Chinese eunuch. And he joins the military, becomes an admiral, and he is going to be in charge of a large fleet of, I believe, like 300 ships. They carry a ton of cargo and they are going to sail into the Indian Ocean, like we talked about in class. Zheng He gives gifts to the locals. He accepts gifts in return. And the goal of this voyage is to reestablish China as a strong state on the world stage, to show off China's military power, their economic strength, their political strength. He's not a merchant. He's not trading, but he's trying to reestablish a Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean. Um, the unfortunate thing is that most of Zheng He's ships later get destroyed. After about 30 years, the Ming leaders view Zheng He as a threat. They don't like his activity and the fact that he's making all these relations with foreigners. So the Ming dynasty does end up destroying all his nautical maps and decommissioning his fleets. Um, and then the Ming dynasty is going to start like um, making it difficult to engage in foreign trade. So that was kind of an early thing with the Ming Dynasty. They initially were sponsoring the voyages of Zheng He, but they're later on going to pull back on that and then not actively promote foreign trade. So that's pretty much it for the Ming Dynasty. Short, not too challenging. I'll put some questions up on Schoology if you want to just practice content memorization to make sure you get the gist of the China part.